He kicked a stray dog, thinking he could get away with it. But at that moment, right in front of his eyes, there was more than just a conflict. A complete stranger came to her aid and not only intervened, but called the police. Everything that seemed easy and unpunished turned out to be a real ordeal. But what happened next would change his life forever. But let's start at the beginning. Nick walked down the street slowly, wearing the same indifferent expression on his face that had become second nature to him. Everything felt familiar, the city around him, the gray buildings, the noise of cars, the endless crowd of people, and in his eyes, the usual apathy towards it all. He was a 25-year-old guy with a fiery temper and a habit of solving problems with force. In his world, there was no room for weakness, and he was certain his behavior would never raise any questions. As he passed a small cafe on the main street, his eyes casually landed on one of the trash bins. There sat a dog. It was a stray, skinny, and dirty, its fur tangled and matted. The poor dog looked like life had given it no chance, its eyes filled with fear and anxiety, its body clearly weakened by hunger and cold. Nick felt something strange. It wasn't sympathy or compassion, but more like irritation. The dog, sitting right next to the trash can, seemed to be invading his little personal space, not fitting the ideal he was used to seeing on the streets of the city. Maybe it was just an annoying moment, this dirty creature, which, in his mind, should have disappeared from his path. He didn't know where this feeling came from, but it was strong enough to make him approach the dog. He didn't think. Nick was sure no one would notice his actions, that no one would dare intervene. He approached, looking down at the dog, and without hesitation, kicked it. The dog jolted, as if struck by lightning, yelping loudly, sending a sharp, prolonged bark that shattered the silence of the street. Everything happened so quickly that Nick didn't even have time to fully realize what he had done. But then, unexpectedly, he felt something new. It wasn't the typical feeling of victory he often experienced when humiliating the weak. Instead, it was like an unexpected moment of awakening, one he hadn't anticipated. The dog, in fear, ran off, its ears pinned back, eyes darting in panic, desperately searching for safety. And while Nick was ready for the dog to run away, he wasn't prepared for the reaction that followed. What he didn't know was that across the street, just a few meters from the cafe, stood Jake. This guy, nothing special, just a regular passerby, who loved peace and quiet, was walking by, lost in his own thoughts. But suddenly, his attention was caught by the scene. He saw the man, almost with disdain, kicking the helpless creature. Jake felt something snap inside him, a wave of anger, a sharp, unexpected response to the injustice. He froze, unsure of what to do. But the feeling of helplessness quickly gave way to resolve. He wasn't the type to seek out conflict, but this was something bigger. Injustice, like a heavy stone, echoed in his chest. Jake couldn't just stand by. A couple of seconds passed, and he was already walking toward Nick. Nick didn't notice, still watching the dog panic on the street, not understanding what was happening. He was certain no one was paying attention to his actions, but in the next second, he felt someone approaching. He glanced over his shoulder, but didn't immediately understand what was going on. "Are you out of your mind?" Jake's voice was sharp, his anger unhidden. "How can you treat an animal like that?" Nick didn't even seem to notice how much his words hit. He turned around, his face full of arrogance, almost sneering at Jake. His confidence was overwhelming. He was older, looked more self-assured, and there wasn't even a hint of fear in his eyes. "Come on, it's just a dog." "Don't worry about it," Nick said, dismissing him as if the dog was just trash to be shoved out of the way. His tone made it clear he was completely certain no one would dare to contradict him. But Jake couldn't just walk away. He felt something snap inside him. Nick's words weren't just unjust, they offended every principle he held. He stepped forward without thinking, his hands clenching into fists, his fingers digging painfully into his palms. His breathing quickened, his heart pounded in his chest. It wasn't just anger, it was fury, triggered by the injustice of the situation. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but he couldn't stay silent. Nick, seeing Jake moving closer, didn't take him seriously. He stood there, confident that his age and arrogance would protect him from any consequences. In his mind, there was no room for doubt. He thought he could humiliate the weak, and no one would stop him. He was sure Jake, this average-looking guy, would just back down in fear. But Jake wasn't backing down. He moved closer, his words firm, filled with determination, and for a moment, Nick fell silent. "I'm not going to hit you, but you will pay for this," Jake said through clenched teeth. He didn't want to escalate to physical violence, but every word carried resolve. He couldn't let this guy walk away without facing the consequences. Jake wasn't aggressive by nature, but when it came to injustice, his moral compass wouldn't let him back down. Nick froze for a moment, his confidence starting to waver. He hadn't expected this from an ordinary passerby. He was used to being the center of attention, used to no one daring to stop him, and expecting everyone in front of him to back down. But something in Jake's voice made him feel uncomfortable. "You serious?" Nick scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. He still thought he had control of the situation, but there was now a hint of doubt in his voice. "You think I'm going to apologize to you?" "No," Jake answered, almost without blinking. "I don't think you need to apologize. I think you need to understand that there are things you need to answer for. And you will answer for this." Nick felt his self-assurance start to crack a little. He was used to never facing opposition. This was the first time his actions had not only shocked someone, but also made him realize that his confidence could actually be questioned. Nick stood there with a smug smile on his face, preparing to dismiss everything happening around him with his usual confidence. He was certain this was all just a waste of time. His laugh rang out loudly and carelessly, as if he'd just heard a joke. There wasn't a hint of regret or fear in his eyes. He was convinced he could always get away without facing any consequences. "Are you serious?" he asked Jake sarcastically, as if he didn't even notice the rising tension around him. He was sure everything would end just as quickly as it had started. Someone would say something, and then everyone would forget. He was already about to turn and walk away when he was interrupted. A man in his mid-40s walked by. He was wearing a sharp coat, with a tired yet determined look in his eyes. He noticed the tense atmosphere and overheard Nick casually humiliating the helpless creature, and it left him no choice but to get involved. The man owned a small animal shelter, and over the years, he had developed a clear stance on cruelty and violence. He knew that acts like Nick's weren't just random outbursts, they were a signal that someone who could so easily harm a defenseless creature needed to face consequences. This couldn't go unpunished. The man approached them, stopped for a moment, and after assessing Nick, spoke in a calm but unexpectedly firm tone, "You may think you're right, kid. But this will not go without consequences." Nick froze, smirking, but something in the man's words made him feel like the situation was slipping out of his control. He glanced at him again, but this time his confidence faltered. The man was already pulling out his phone, and his calm demeanor was so resolute that even Nick felt a chill run down his spine. The man dialed a number slowly and, speaking into the phone, said, "I just witnessed an act of animal cruelty. Please send a patrol to Central Street. Right now." As if in response to his request, police cars appeared in the next few minutes. Officers got out of the cars, and upon noticing Nick, they headed straight for him. They already knew they'd be dealing with something more than a casual conversation, and Nick's self-satisfied posture and disregard for what was happening only confirmed that this wouldn't be an ordinary chat. Feeling the eyes of people focused on him, Nick began to lose his confidence. He gritted his teeth and tried to justify himself, but all his attempts to dismiss what had happened fell flat. The officers approached him and started asking questions, while the men from the shelter stood nearby, his gaze fixed on what was unfolding. "We'll take your statement," one of the officers said, not giving Nick a chance to escape reality. Nick tried to convince himself that this was just a misunderstanding. He still hoped he could talk his way out of it, like he always did, but the situation was unfolding far from how he'd imagined. This man, a stranger to him, with his calm resolve, and the officers, whose looks weren't filled with leniency, made it clear, consequences were coming. What had started as a typical act of impunity soon became a painful lesson for Nick. Everything he thought he could get away with suddenly stood before him. He found himself in the spotlight, and now it was clear, there would be no room for his usual sense of invulnerability. This was the moment when anger led to consequences, and there was no escaping them. Time passed, and everything that had seemed harmless to Nick turned into a heavy lesson. The next morning, while he was still trying to justify himself and find a way out of the situation, the police confirmed all the charges and arrested him. The laws in the state were strict, and animal cruelty didn't go unpunished. Still full of arrogance, Nick couldn't believe that his reckless act would lead to such serious consequences. The trial was a real test for him. Despite his protests, his attempts to justify his actions with laughter or disdain, the court left no room for excuses. Under the gaze of numerous witnesses, including Jake, the case unfolded clearly and decisively. The law, whether he liked it or not, sided with those demanding justice. Nick was fined and sentenced to community service. He was ordered to work at an animal shelter. This was a punishment that didn't allow him to escape the work. He found himself in the center of a reality he had once easily ignored. The thoughts of his impunity, which had once seemed natural, now turned into emptiness. Jake, as a witness in the trial, felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that justice had left no room for impunity. He knew that this might not be enough to change Nick permanently, but it was a step in the right direction. It was the restoration of justice in a world where, at times, it seems like evil goes unanswered. Jake was proud of the fact that he hadn't stayed silent, but had intervened when it mattered. It was his small way of restoring order, even though he wasn't seeking fame for his actions. When Nick began working at the shelter, his reality changed drastically. At first, it felt like real punishment, dirty work, caring for animals he had once considered unworthy of respect. But with each passing day, each hour spent among these creatures, his attitude began to change. He started to realize that dogs, cats, and perhaps other stray animals weren't just helpless beings, they were living, feeling creatures, in need of care. And their lives, like any other, deserved respect. Nick became more reserved, more attentive. He no longer laughed at every animal he encountered at the shelter. He began to listen to them, noticing the small signs of fear or trust. He understood that every creature, even if it found itself in dire circumstances, had the right to respect. The cruelty he had once underestimated slowly faded, giving way to the realization of the importance of caring for living beings. And though this was only the first but significant transformation, for Nick, it was a true turning point. Jake, hearing about Nick's change, felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He knew that real restoration of justice wasn't just about punishment, but also about a chance for redemption, a chance to change one's views. With his help, justice had been restored, and perhaps Nick had begun his journey toward understanding that true strength wasn't in cruelty, but in the ability to show care and respect for those who are weaker.